Summer storms in the small towns of Maine were never gentle or predictable. They rolled in out of nowhere, violent and unforgiving, swallowing the quiet countryside in a matter of minutes. By 11 o'clock at night, the downpour had spiraled completely out of control. Fat, heavy raindrops hammered relentlessly against the aging cedar roof of the remote cottage, producing a chaotic, incessant clatter that sounded like hundreds of frantic hands slamming against the wooden planks, desperate to break through. Gusting winds tore through the trees, whipping mist and rain hard against the fogged window panes. Every few seconds, a jagged flash of pale white lightning split the pitch-black sky, illuminating the desolate countryside for a fleeting heartbeat before vanishing into the endless dark. Thunder boomed low and constant, vibrating through the ground and every wooden beam in the house, sinking the entire town into a suffocating, damp stillness. My name is Elias, and I am 61 years old. For an entire decade, this isolated single-story cottage tucked away on the edge of town has been my only home, my only company through countless quiet, empty nights. Inside the house, a warm table lamp cast a soft, muted glow, carefully adjusted to avoid harsh glare. My small woodworking workshop area was neat and orderly, every tool arranged in its fixed place after years of consistent routine. The air held a familiar, comforting blend of pine timber scent and the faint, earthy oil aroma of well-worn hand tools. I sat at my sanding bench, my fingers curled firmly around fine-grit sandpaper, smoothing the worn armrest of an old walnut chair. It was a minor commission, a furniture restoration job for an elderly lady in town. Nothing urgent, nothing strenuous, just simple, steady work to fill the endless quiet hours of my solitary life. Solitude had long become my default way of living. The days blurred together in gentle, repetitive stillness, so quiet I could hear the slow rise and fall of my own breath in the empty rooms. My wife, Mary, had passed away suddenly years ago, taken by a sudden heart attack with no final words, no chance for a proper goodbye. I was 51 then, and half the warmth and purpose in my life had vanished with her in an instant. But the grief that truly hollowed me out, the loss I never managed to fully recover from, came right on the heels of her passing. Our son, Lane, had been 22 back then, young, hot-headed, sharp around the edges, convinced he knew everything about life, stubbornly resistant to every word of guidance I offered. A trivial, foolish, utterly meaningless argument had torn us apart that year. We'd shouted until our throats burned, refusing to back down, both too proud to soften our tempers, hurling cruel, unforgivable words that neither of us truly meant. By dawn the next morning, before the town had woken up, before I could even process the bitter fight we'd had, he grabbed his suitcase and stormed out the front door, slamming it hard enough to rattle the walls. He never came back. Not a single call, not a text, not a handwritten note, not a fleeting visit. 10 years. A full decade of absolute silence from my only child. No holiday greetings, no random check-ins, no accidental encounters on the small town streets. Our town was tiny, where everyone knew everyone's business, where neighbors crossed paths daily without fail, and yet I never once laid eyes on Lane again. In the early years, relatives had stopped by regularly, trying to mend the rift, repeating the age-old truth that fathers and sons never hold grudges long, that youth was reckless and fleeting. But as the years dragged on with no sign of reconciliation, no word from my son, they slowly stopped mentioning his name entirely. Everyone had quietly accepted that the father and son who'd once been inseparable were now strangers for life. I continued sanding the walnut wood, fine sawdust drifting down to settle lightly on my weathered palms. The texture was rough yet steady, tangible proof of a job being done right. I had spent my entire life as a woodworker, mastering the art of patience and repair. I'd learned to fix every flaw in timber, fill every gap, sand down every sharp burr, smooth out every warped imperfection until the wood was perfect. But there was one crack I could never mend, the fractured bond between my son and me. For 10 long years, I'd avoided touching that wound entirely, too afraid to confront the pain, too unsure of how to begin fixing what had broken. Another roll of thunder rumbled in the distance, growing louder and closer until the entire window frame trembled under its weight. I rubbed the tiredness from my stinging eyes, ready to set down my tools, turn off the lamp, and surrender to another lonely night. That was when a frantic, desperate knocking shattered the heavy silence of the cottage. Bang, bang, bang. This was no casual, hesitant tap of a neighbor stopping by. It was fierce, forceful, unrelenting, the kind of knocking born of pure terror and urgency, each impact sharp and disjointed, cutting sharply through the lulls between thunderclaps. The sound sent an immediate jolt of tension racing down my spine, a primal warning that something was very wrong outside. My chest tightened with foreboding. At this hour, in this catastrophic weather, the unpaved country roads outside my cottage were flooded and churned into thick, impassable mud. No one in their right mind would be out wandering the countryside, let alone visiting a remote cottage miles from the nearest cluster of homes. My neighbors all lived well away from this isolated stretch, and nighttime visitors were unheard of. The knocking persisted, growing more frantic by the second. Beneath the loud pounding, I caught the faint, muffled sound of a child's quiet, suppressed sobbing, seeping through the thick wooden door, weak, fragile, and heart-wrenchingly pitiful. I set down my sandpaper slowly, pushing myself upright from the bench. The old wooden floorboards creaked softly under my weight, a familiar sound that usually brought comfort, but now felt eerie against the stormy backdrop. At 61, I had spent a lifetime avoiding trouble, turning away conflict, yet I had never been one to cower from it either. I reached for the thick oak walking cane propped beside the door, handcrafted by my own hands. Solid, sturdy, reliable, my quiet safeguard through years of solitary rural life. I moved cautiously toward the entrance, not rushing to open the door, my voice low and guarded as I called out into the storm. "Who's there?" The knocking ceased instantly. For a split second, thick silence hung over the cottage, broken only by the howl of wind and pound of rain. Then a young child's voice trembled through the wood, high, shaky, and broken with uncontrollable tears, bordering on desperate hysteria. "Please open the door. I'm begging you, they're chasing me. Please save me." It was a little boy, no older than 7 or 8, his tone thick with terror, like he was moments away from collapsing entirely under his fear. My wariness melted away in an instant, replaced by a sharp, piercing compassion. No child should be running for their life alone on a storm-stricken night, terrified and helpless. No decent person could turn their back on such a fragile, desperate plea. Without further hesitation, I slid open the wooden latch and pulled the door wide. A frigid gust of wind and rain exploded into the warm cottage in an instant, carrying a biting cold that cut straight through my clothes. A tiny figure stumbled forward off the porch, collapsing unsteadily onto the fuzzy entryway rug, his small body crumpling under exhaustion and fear. The sight of him twisted my heart sharply in my chest. He could not have been more than 7 years old. Every inch of his small frame was soaked to the bone, his thin faded t-shirt clinging tightly to his slight shoulders and bony torso, shivering violently from the freezing temperature. His damp hair matted against his deathly pale forehead, rainwater mixing with silent tears streaming down his cheeks. His lips were tinged a sickly blue from the cold, and his jeans were caked head to toe in dark mud. One knee was scraped raw and bleeding, the fabric torn open to reveal fresh, tender wounds from his desperate run through rough terrain. He refused to lift his head, his small fingers clutching the hem of his shirt, so tightly his knuckles whitened. His shoulders shook with every quiet sob, his voice barely audible as he repeated his terrified plea over and over. "They're after me! They want to take me away! Please don't let them find me, sir!" I slammed the door shut behind him in one swift motion, sliding the latch firmly back into place to lock out the raging storm and whatever danger had been hunting the boy. Years of solitary living had hardened my heart to small hardships, made me quiet and reserved and self-sufficient. But all that cold toughness dissolved the second I saw his terrified, trembling form. I softened my tone completely, speaking gently and steadily to calm his frantic nerves. "You're safe now, kid. No one's going to hurt you here. You're safe." I knelt down slowly, lowering my tall frame to his level, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle the already traumatized child. He kept his head bowed, his shoulders trembling nonstop, fresh tears dripping steadily onto the damp rug beneath his feet, darkening the fabric in tiny, scattered splotches. "Let's get you warm first." I stood and crossed to the entryway cabinet, pulling out a thick, plush wool towel I reserved for brutal winter storms. Soft, heavy and warm. I draped it gently over his small head, my hands moving slowly and carefully as I dabbed at his soaking hair and icy cheeks, mindful of his scraped knee and fragile state, afraid of causing him even the slightest bit of pain. The boy never flinched or pulled away. He pressed his lips tightly together in a rigid line, his dark eyes fixed unblinkingly on the locked front door, his whole body coiled tight like a frightened wild animal that had barely escaped a predator's grasp, still hypervigilant and ready to flee at the slightest threat. A heavy, aching sadness settled deep in my chest as I watched him. This little boy should have been tucked safely in a warm bed, cared for by his parents, sheltered from the dark and the storm and the cruelty of the world. He should never have been forced to run for his life through mud and rain, alone and terrified, carrying burdens no child was ever meant to bear. Come on. I placed a light, gentle hand on his upper arm, guiding him slowly toward the living room sofa. The fireplace was cold and unlit, but the enclosed room held far more warmth than the howling storm outside, enough to slowly chase the chill from his frozen body. I retreated to the kitchen, flipping on the gas burner to heat a pot of fresh water. I fetched cocoa powder and whole milk from the pantry, simmering them together into a rich, steaming mug of hot cocoa. From the fridge, I pulled a loaf of fresh whole-grain bread I'd baked the day before, sliced 2 thick pieces, and spread a thin layer of wild honey over the top, hoping the simple sweetness might soothe his frayed nerves. When I carried the warm drink and food back into the living room, the boy hadn't moved an inch. He sat stiff and rigid on the edge of the sofa, his gaze still locked firmly on the front door. Every muscle in his body tensed, the terror in his eyes never fading for a single second. Eat something. It'll warm you up. I held out the steaming mug of cocoa to him. The hot glass instantly warmed his frozen, red fingertips as he hesitantly reached out to take it. His fingers trembled slightly at the first touch of warmth, a small, visible sign of relief after hours of bitter cold and fear. He drank quickly, almost greedily, sipping the hot cocoa in large, desperate gulps, as if the warmth of the drink could chase away the cold terror rooted deep in his bones. Slowly, gradually, the rigid tension seeped out of his shoulders, his body relaxing minuscule by minuscule with every swallow of the sweet, warm liquid. I settled onto a wooden chair across from him, watching quietly, asking no questions, pushing for no answers. I knew better than to pressure a terrified child. Right then, he didn't need interrogation or explanation. He needed safety, stability, and quiet kindness. When he was ready to talk, he would. By the time he finished the entire mug of cocoa and ate both slices of honey bread, the deathly paleness faded from his face, a faint, healthy pink returning to his cheeks. The blue tint on his lips vanished completely, replaced by a soft, natural tone. I spoke gently, my voice calm and unrushed, careful not to startle him. "What's your name, kiddo? And who was chasing you?" The boy stared down at the empty cocoa mug in his lap for a long, quiet moment, remaining silent as he gathered his shaky courage. His voice was small and faint when he finally answered, barely louder than a whisper. "My name's Jamie. Jamie." A soft, sweet, ordinary name, perfectly suited to his quiet, timid demeanor in that moment. "They're looking for my mom and dad." His voice was still rough and hoarse from crying, his words broken and disjointed as he struggled to tell his story. "My parents haven't been home in a long time. They owe people money. Those 2 men come every day looking for them. When they can't find my mom and dad, they try to take me instead. They said they're going to make me pay their debts for them. I saw them coming today, so I ran. I ran as fast as I could until I got here." A heavy stone settled over my heart, weighing down my chest with quiet sorrow. I'd lived in this small town my entire life, seen every kind of hardship, every dark corner of quiet small-town life. I knew of the addiction, the debt cycles, the broken families that lingered unseen beneath the town's peaceful surface. But I had never imagined a child so young would be forced to pay for his parents' mistakes, forced to flee for his life, abandoned and alone in a cruel world. "How long has it been since you've seen your parents?" I asked softly. Jamie shook his head slowly, his young eyes filling with a blank, helpless confusion that broke my heart. "I don't remember. It's been forever. I live alone now. I eat alone. I sleep alone. All the time. I knew solitary living better than most. I'd spent 10 years alone in this cottage, enduring quiet days and empty nights. But my loneliness had been peaceful, stable, chosen. A quiet retirement after a lifetime of work, a safe solitude. Jamie's loneliness was desperate, fragile, and dangerous, the loneliness of a child abandoned and unprotected in a harsh world. I stood and fetched my first aid kit from the hallway, kneeling once more in front of the small boy. I cleaned the scrapes on his knee with gentle precision, disinfecting the raw wounds carefully before applying soft bandages. Years of woodworking had left my hands steady and deliberate, my movements gentle and sure. Jamie stayed perfectly still, cooperating without resistance, his big eyes fixed quietly on my face. The wariness in his gaze faded little by little, replaced by a faint, tentative glimmer of trust and dependence. "You don't have to be scared tonight." I closed the first aid kit, meeting his eyes sincerely. "You're safe here with me. No one's gonna hurt you. Rest easy. Everything will be better once the sun comes up." Jamie nodded his head slightly, his voice tiny and grateful. "Thank you, sir." Outside, the storm still raged relentlessly, thunder rumbling intermittently in the distance. But for the first time in hours, the lonely cottage felt less empty, less cold. The faint presence of the small boy softened the decade-old silence that had hung over my home. I resolved silently that once morning broke, I would find proper help for him, make sure he never had to run and hide in terror ever again. But that fragile peace did not last long. Just as I was about to settle Jamie comfortably on the sofa to rest, a sharp, distant wail cut through the storm. Sirens, growing louder, closer, clearer by the second, cutting through the rain and thunder to pierce the quiet night. Wail, wail, wail. The shrill emergency tones sliced through the dark countryside, traveling down the empty rural road until they came to an abrupt stop directly outside my cottage front yard. My stomach dropped sharply, a cold dread settling deep in my gut. I snapped my gaze toward Jamie instantly. All the color drained from his face in an instant. His body went rigid with terror, his small hands clamping tight around the sofa armrests, his lips trembling uncontrollably as fresh panic flooded his eyes. "It's them!" he cried, his voice breaking with fresh tears. "They called the cops. They're gonna take me away." I pressed a firm, steady hand to his trembling shoulder, my tone strong and reassuring, refusing to let him spiral into fear. "Don't you dare panic. I'm right here. Nobody's taking you anywhere." In that split second, there was no hesitation in my mind, no doubt, no second thoughts. My only instinct, my only priority, was protecting this terrified little boy. I assumed the debt collectors had fabricated a police report, abusing law enforcement authority to hunt down a defenseless child. I had lived an honest, blameless life for 61 years. I had broken no laws, harmed no one. Sheltering a scared, hunted child was not a crime. I had nothing to hide, nothing to fear. I drew in a deep breath, steadying my nerves, straightening my shoulders. I would face the officers calmly, explain the situation clearly, and shield this helpless child from harm. I unlatched the front door and stepped out into the raging storm. Cold rain lashed against my face and hair instantly, soaking through my thin flannel shirt, icy wind piercing straight through my layers to chill my bones. The street lamp at the end of my driveway glowed dim and hazy through the thick rain fog, casting a blurred white glow over my front yard. 2 police cruisers sat parked directly in my empty yard, their bright headlights cutting sharply through the mist and darkness, illuminating every corner of the property. Several uniformed officers stood beside the vehicles, their postures straight and disciplined, their expressions serious and alert, the typical stern, focused demeanor of officers responding to an emergency night call. I tugged my flannel tighter against the cold, stepping forward a few paces, ready to explain everything. I planned to tell them about the frightened little boy hiding in my home, how I'd only offered shelter to a child fleeing harassment, how no harm had been done to anyone. But the second my eyes landed on the lead officer standing at the front of the group, every word died in my throat. My breath caught completely in my chest, my blood turning cold in my veins. I froze solid on the rain-soaked lawn, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to process what I was seeing. It was him. It was Lane, my son, the boy who'd vanished 10 years prior without a single word, the child I'd grieved and missed and waited for every single day for a decade. 10 years was long enough to reshape a person entirely. The hot-headed, naive 22-year-old boy I'd known was gone completely. In his place stood a mature, disciplined adult man. He wore a crisp, dark blue police uniform that fit his broad, tall frame perfectly. His shoulders were wide and sturdy, his jawline sharp and firm, his eyes calm and authoritative, the face of a responsible, dependable public servant, a far cry from the reckless teenager I'd last argued with all those years ago. He was taller, stronger, quieter now, every inch a grown man, weathered and steadied by time and responsibility. In the same instant, Lane froze too. The stern focus melted instantly from his face. The sharp alertness in his eyes vanished, replaced by raw, unguarded shock and frantic disbelief. His fingers tightened violently around the radio in his hand until his knuckles blanched white. He stood motionless in the pouring rain, his gaze locked rigidly on me, stunned speechless by the unexpected encounter. Father and son, separated by 10 years of empty silence, divided by the howling night storm, reunited completely by accident in the darkest hour. There was no joy, no warm embrace, no relieved greeting. Only suffocating silence, a tidal wave of repressed emotions crashing over both of us, years of longing, regret, grief, and unspoken hurt piling up so thick it was hard to breathe. Rain soaked through his uniform, dripped down my face and neck, chilled our skin to the bone. The wind howled around us, yet I felt no cold at all. My chest burned hot and tight, a sharp, bittersweet ache spreading through every part of my heart. I had imagined our reunion countless times over the decade. I'd pictured running into him on a quiet town street, crossing paths on a calm evening, or reuniting when I was old and frail. I'd imagined anger, arguments, stubborn silence, bitter accusations. But I had never, in a million years, pictured this. I'd spent 10 lonely years in this isolated cottage. I'd sheltered a terrified child on a stormy night, and my long-lost son had arrived on my doorstep in a police uniform, here on official business, forced to face me as an officer first, a son second. Embarrassment, sorrow, absurdity, and regret tangled together in my chest, squeezing my heart until it ached unbearably. A fellow officer's quiet voice cut through the heavy stillness. "Officer," the single question shattered the frozen moment. Lane jolted back to awareness, his eyes flashing with panic as he forced down the flood of personal emotion, scrambling to regain his professional composure. His Adam's apple bobbed hard as he swallowed thickly, brushing the rain from his cheeks with a shaking hand. He took 2 stiff, hesitant steps forward across the wet grass. His voice was low, rough, and unsteady, threaded with the faint tremor of long-buried feeling and years of painful distance. "Dad!" One simple word, a single syllable bridging 10 years of empty separation. That one word was all it took to make my eyes burn with tears. I'd waited a full decade to hear him call me that again. 10 years of silent nights, 10 years of wondering if I'd ever hear my son's voice, 10 years of fearing I'd lost him forever. In that moment, all the loneliness of those years crashed over me at once. I parted my lips to speak, but my throat was dry and tight, no words coming out. I could only stand there, staring at the son I'd missed more than life itself. Lane shifted his gaze away from mine, hiding the vulnerability in his eyes, forcing his tone back into formal professionalism, though his voice remained thick with emotion. We received a civilian report of an adult male pursuing and intimidating a minor child on the rural roadside. We tracked the victim's trail here to this residence. My mind cleared instantly, piecing together the full truth. It had not been the debt collectors who called the police. A passing resident had witnessed 2 men chasing a defenseless little boy through the rain, recognized the danger, and dialed emergency services out of concern for the child's safety. Lane's patrol unit had been assigned the call, following the trail straight to my isolated cottage home. Inside the house, Jamie must have heard the voices outside. I caught a faint movement at the living room window as he carefully lifted the curtain, peering out at the police cars with lingering, anxious uncertainty. I pushed aside the storm of emotions swirling in my chest, meeting Lane's eyes steadily, my tone honest and calm. The boy's inside. He was being chased and needed shelter from the storm. I only let him in, fed him, and kept him safe. I haven't harmed him in any way. Lane's gaze locked onto mine, earnest and steady, quiet trust shining clearly in his eyes. "I know. I believe you. No suspicion, No rigorous questioning, no professional doubt. Even after 10 years of estrangement, even with all the unspoken tension between us, he trusted my character completely. Those 4 simple words broke through the cold, hardened wall I'd built around my heart over 10 lonely years. Standing there in the pouring rain, staring at the strong, honorable man my son had become, I suddenly knew my decade of solitude was finally over. The follow-up police process unfolded gently and smoothly, free of tension or conflict. Lane instructed his fellow officers to enter the cottage and speak with Jamie. The officers were calm, patient, and incredibly gentle with the frightened child, speaking in soft, reassuring tones as they took his statement and documented the full details of his ordeal. There was no harshness, no intimidation, only professional care for the vulnerable minor. Jamie clung tightly to the hem of my shirt at first, too scared to speak to the strangers in uniform. I knelt down beside him, brushing my hand softly over his trembling back, murmuring quiet reassurance. These men are good people. They're here to protect you. No one's ever going to hurt you again. Bolstered by my comfort and the officer's gentle patience, Jamie slowly let go of his fear. He told them everything: his parents' unpaid debts, the constant harassment from collectors, his repeated attempts to hide and run, the years of neglect and loneliness he'd endured alone. Once the official statement was recorded, Lane contacted the town's child welfare services. Despite the late hour, an on-call social worker arrived promptly to take custody of Jamie, offering him gentle comfort and stable, reliable care. The worker promised permanent, safe housing and long-term support to resolve all the troubles haunting the young boy's life. I breathed a deep, genuine sense of relief as I watched the social worker lead Jamie safely to their vehicle. The worst of the child's terrifying night was finally over. The storm still raged outside, but Jamie's days of running and hiding in fear were done. The other officers cleared the scene and drove off into the night, leaving only Lane standing quietly in my front yard. He powered down his patrol radio, shedding the last traces of his professional authority, no longer an on-duty officer, only my son, burdened with 10 years of unspoken guilt and regret. The rain slowed to a soft, steady drizzle, the distant thunder fading completely. The night turned quiet and calm, perfect for the long-overdue conversation we'd avoided for a decade. "Come inside." I stepped aside, holding the door open for him. Lane nodded silently, stepping carefully across the threshold into the home he hadn't entered in 10 years. His footsteps were light and hesitant, as if he feared disturbing the quiet stillness of the house, his eyes sweeping slowly over every familiar piece of furniture, every detail frozen in time from his childhood. Nothing had changed. The same wooden sofa, the same dining table, the same woodworking bench in the corner, the same familiar pine scent lingering in the air. Only time had left its mark: faded wood, worn edges, a quiet emptiness that had settled over the rooms during his absence. I closed the door behind us, sealing off the stormy night, leaving us enclosed in the warm, quiet lamplight. The silence between us was thick, layered with 10 years of distance, awkwardness, suppressed longing, and unspoken sorrow. I watched my son quietly, drinking in the mature, steady man he'd become. The impulsive, stubborn, hot-tempered boy of 22 was gone forever. In his place stood a brave, principled, compassionate man who dedicated his life to protecting others. After a long stretch of heavy silence, Lane finally spoke first. He lifted his head to meet my gaze, his eyes glistening with raw remorse, his voice thick and hoarse with emotion. "Dad, I'm so sorry." 3 simple words, carrying a decade's worth of guilt, regret, and unspoken apology crashing between us after years of silence. It was all my fault. I was young and reckless, stubborn and selfish. I didn't understand you, didn't appreciate everything you did for me. Lane's voice trembled faintly, each word sincere and heavy with remorse. That fight was over nothing, completely meaningless. I was too proud to back down, too stubborn to admit I was wrong. I said terrible things to you, all out of petty pride, and then I walked out and never came back. I listened quietly, my chest aching with bittersweet emotion, my eyes growing warm with held-back tears. I remembered that fight perfectly, clear as if it had happened yesterday. Fresh out of college, 22 and full of naive ambition, Lane had been obsessed with risky, impulsive startup investments. He drained all his personal savings and planned to borrow large sums of money to chase an unstable dream, blind to every risk and warning. A lifelong carpenter who'd built my life on steady, honest, careful work, I'd refused to watch him throw his future away on reckless gambles. I'd stepped in to stop him, firm and unyielding. He'd seen my caution as stubborn close-mindedness, my protection as restriction. He'd accused me of never understanding his dreams, of always holding him back, of making his home feel suffocating. Then he'd stormed out, furious and unforgiving. I'd been angry too, hurt and bitter by his cruelty and ingratitude. In the heat of the moment, I'd snapped and told him if he walked out that door, he should never come back. A foolish, angry sentence. A single moment of pride that cost us 10 long years of family. I regretted it the very next day. Lane clenched his hands tightly, his tone filled with endless sorrow. I stood on the empty street with my suitcase, and I instantly knew I'd messed up. I knew I'd hurt you, knew I'd wasted the love and grace you'd always given me. But my pride wouldn't let me come home. I thought I'd make something of myself first, build a successful life, and then come back worthy of apologizing to you. He stared at me, his gaze heavy with exhaustion and regret. But the longer I stayed away, the harder it was to come back. 1 year turned to 2, 2 turned to 10. I was terrified you still hated me, terrified you'd never forgive me, terrified we'd never fix what we'd broken. I paused for a long moment, then asked softly, "How were these 10 years for you?" "Terrible." Lane did not hesitate to answer, his tone honest and raw. I never felt at peace. No matter where I went, what I did, there was always an empty space in my chest. I was always thinking of you, always worrying about you alone in this house. He revealed the truth he'd hidden for a decade. He had never left this town at all. After leaving home, he'd rented a small apartment on the opposite side of town. He'd studied diligently, joined the police academy after graduation, and become a local patrol officer. He'd stayed within a few miles of our home every single day, never daring to cross the threshold of the cottage again. I watched over you this whole time. His voice was soft, pained, and tender. Every patrol shift, I'd drive down this road. I'd check if your lights were on, if the yard was intact, if everything was all right. I worried about your heat in the winter, about storm damage in the summer. Every bad weather night, my eyes would drift straight toward this house. I knew you were alone. I knew you had no one to look after you. So many nights I stood at the end of the road, staring at your porch light, wanting nothing more than to knock on the door, apologize, and come home. But I always lost my nerve. I was too scared you'd turn me away. As I listened to his quiet confession, every ounce of bitterness, loneliness, and resentment I'd carried for 10 years melted completely away. I could fix every flawed piece of timber with my hands, sand away every crack and imperfection in wood. But I'd spent a decade believing my son had abandoned me willingly, that he'd forgotten his home and his father entirely. I'd never known he'd been right there all along, just as trapped by pride and regret as I was, just as lonely and longing for reconciliation. I lifted my hand and rested it gently on his broad shoulder, feeling the solid strength of the man he'd become after 10 years of growth. A profound sense of peace settled over my heart. I never hated you, son. I spoke softly, sincerely, every bit of my heart in the words. I just missed you. Every single day I missed you. Lane's head snapped up, and tears finally spilled freely down his cheeks. 10 years of suppressed grief, guilt, and longing breaking loose at last. No more anger, no more pride, no more distance. Only two broken people, finally finding each other again. We talked through the entire night, long past midnight, until the first faint hints of dawn tinted the sky. We shared every detail of our separate lives over the decade. His struggles as a new officer, my quiet solitary routines, the foolish argument that divided us, the silent grief we both carried alone. Slowly, carefully, we untangled every misunderstanding, smoothed over every hurt, mended every crack in our broken bond. The 10 years of empty silence was finally filled with honest, heartfelt conversation. By morning, the storm had passed entirely. The dark storm clouds scattered, and soft, gentle dawn light spilled over the treetops, painting the countryside in warm, pale gold. I looked at the mature, honorable man beside me and knew without a shadow of doubt the empty 10 years were no longer a tragedy. We'd lost each other for a decade, but we'd finally found our way back home. The morning after the storm brought fresh, crisp air to the small town. The rain had washed every tree and blade of grass clean, leaving the countryside vibrant and green. Soft sunlight filtered through the scattered clouds, spreading gentle warmth over the quiet neighborhood. Lane traded his shift with a colleague, choosing to stay home with me instead of returning to duty. For the first time in 10 years, we had a quiet, unrushed morning together. The cottage yard had grown wild during my years of solitude, tall weeds creeping along the fence line, loose and weathered wooden planks, fallen leaves and storm debris covering the steps. Lane grabbed my old yard tools and set to work silently, clearing the weeds, repairing the loose fencing, sweeping the steps clean with steady, efficient movements. I stood on the porch watching him work, sunlight gilding his figure. For the first time in a decade, the lonely yard felt alive, warm, and inhabited. The endless quiet solitude that had defined my days was finally gone. I walked into the kitchen and cooked a proper breakfast for 2, fried eggs, toasted bread, and warm milk. It was a simple, ordinary meal, but it was the first time in 10 years I hadn't eaten alone at my own table. Breakfast was calm and easy, free of the awkward tension of the night before. We chatted casually about small-town happenings, trivial daily matters, quiet, ordinary conversation that filled the empty spaces of our lost years. You can come home anytime you want. I set down my fork, looking at him earnestly. This house will always be your home. The door's always open. No more guilt, no more fear. Just come back. Lane smiled softly, his eyes warm and grateful, nodding firmly. I will. I'll come home every single day. From that morning forward, my 10 years of solitude ended completely. Lane continued to serve the town faithfully as a patrol officer dedicated to his job and community. But he never stayed away from home long. Every evening after his shift ended, he came straight back to the cottage, keeping me company through dinner and quiet nights, helping me maintain the house and yard. On quiet evenings, he would sit beside my woodworking bench, watching me carve and sand timber, listening quietly as I shared decades of carpentry tips and stories. Sometimes he'd help me pass tools and organize my supplies, working alongside me in peaceful, comfortable silence. The once silent cottage bloomed with life and laughter. The television was no longer just empty background noise. Dinner was no longer a solitary, quiet ritual. The porch light no longer burned only for one lonely man. A few days later, the child welfare social worker contacted Lane and me with updates on Jamie's case. Jamie's parents faced legal consequences for long-term drug abuse, unpaid debts, and criminal child abandonment. Court rulings formally terminated their guardianship rights, placing Jamie permanently under state child welfare protection. He was placed in a stable, supervised group home with consistent care, regular schooling, and complete safety from the collectors who had once hunted him. Freed from fear and instability, Jamie transformed completely. The constant terror in his eyes faded, replaced by bright, childish joy and innocence. The social worker told us repeatedly that Jamie spoke often of the kind carpenter who'd sheltered him on that terrible stormy night, never forgetting the safety and warmth I'd given him in his darkest hour. He constantly asked to come visit. That single night of kindness had rippled outward in ways I never could have imagined. I'd sheltered a scared child, and in doing so, I'd healed my own broken family, mending 10 years of father-son fracture and loneliness. Every weekend after that, the social worker brought Jamie to our cottage to visit. The little boy was bright, cheerful, and well-behaved during every visit. He helped me weed the yard, tidy the porch, and organize my woodworking tools, no longer the trembling, terrified child from the rainy night. His face was always lit up with genuine, carefree smiles, full of the unburdened joy of a safe, loved child. I baked his favorite small pastries and brewed sweet hot cocoa for him every time he came. We played together in the yard on calm afternoons. On Lane's days off, the three of us walked the town trails together, chatted quietly, and enjoyed simple, peaceful family time. The cottage that had known only silence and loneliness for a decade now echoed with constant laughter, warm father-son conversation, bright childish giggles, the gentle hum of true home life. The quiet rural house was finally full of warm, living humanity. Word of our reconciliation spread quickly through the small town's tight-knit community. Relatives and neighbors who had once distanced themselves during our decade-long rift began visiting again, letting go of old tensions and awkwardness. The fractured family connections from years prior slowly healed and regrew, restoring warmth and closeness to our family circle. After 60 years of life, I finally understood the truest meaning of happiness. It was never about being right or winning arguments or clinging to pride. It was about family, connection, and the quiet, precious gift of having loved ones beside you through every season of life. Early autumn brought soft, mild weather to Maine. The harsh summer storms faded away, replaced by warm, gentle afternoons with golden sunlight filtering softly through the tree leaves, never too bright or too hot. The cottage yard flourished beautifully after months of rain and sunshine, the vegetation lush and vibrant. I sat in my handmade wooden rocking chair on the porch, slowly sanding a small custom wooden chair, carefully shaping every curve and smoothing every edge with meticulous precision. I was building it specifically for Jamie. During every visit, he'd sat patiently on the concrete porch steps, never complaining. I wanted him to have a proper, comfortable chair of his own for relaxing and playing during his weekends with us. I heard familiar footsteps on the gravel driveway before I saw him, the steady rhythm instantly recognizable after months of daily routine. Lane rounded the corner into the yard, out of uniform and dressed in casual civilian clothes, his professional sternness completely gone. He looked relaxed, warm, and unguarded, fully at home in the space he'd missed for so long. "Dad, I'm home." He carried a paper bag of fresh groceries and seasonal produce, smiling gently as he stepped into the yard. "You're home early today." I looked up from my woodwork, returning his smile with warm fondness. "Shift wrapped up early today, no emergencies." He set the groceries in the kitchen, then returned to kneel beside my rocking chair, glancing curiously at the small wooden seat in my hands. "Making that for Jamie?" "Yeah." I nodded softly. "Little kids grow fast. He'll be more comfortable in a proper chair." Lane watched me work quietly for a long moment, his tone soft and thoughtful. "Did you build a lot of these little things to pass the time while I was gone?" I set down my sandpaper, glancing up at the clear blue sky, breathing in the warm autumn air. "I used to build them to kill time. Now I build them because I'm finally living it. For 10 years, my days have been a slow, weary struggle to endure endless solitude. I'd filled my empty hours with woodworking to survive the loneliness, clinging to quiet routine to get through each long, empty day. There had been no hope, no warmth, no looking forward to tomorrow. But everything had changed. My days now had purpose, warmth, and joy. I had a son who came home every night, a little boy who loved visiting, and a house full of genuine happiness. Lane's voice was quiet and remorseful, yet full of gratitude. "I'm so sorry I made you live alone for 10 years, Dad. I'm so sorry I stole all those quiet, happy days from you. I'm never leaving you alone again. Not ever." I patted his arm gently, my heart full of peaceful contentment. In old age, a person wants very little from life. We crave no wealth, no fame, no grand success. We only want our children safe, our family close, and our final years peaceful and loved. It's all in the past now. I smiled softly. Youth is always full of foolish mistakes and impulsive choices. What matters isn't the errors we made before. What matters is that we found our way back to each other. The setting sun spilled golden light across the entire yard, wrapping the cottage, the trees, and us in soft, warm glow. This was peace. Simple, quiet, perfect peace, the greatest gift a lifetime could offer. Late in the afternoon, the social worker arrived with Jamie for his weekly visit. The little boy darted into the yard the second the car parked, his eyes lighting up the moment he spotted the finished wooden chair on the porch. He ran over quickly, pure delight shining brightly on his face. "Is this for me? It's so beautiful. Do you like it?" I asked, amused by his pure, unfiltered joy. "I love it. It's the best chair ever." Jamie carefully climbed onto the small wooden chair, swinging his little legs happily, his smile bright and unburdened, full of the unspoiled light of a happy, loved child. Lane and I exchanged a warm, grateful smile, our hearts full of gentle satisfaction. The frightened, abandoned little boy who'd run for his life through a stormy night now had safety, happiness, and belonging. The father and son, separated by 10 years of pride and silence, were finally reunited, healing old wounds with every quiet day together. Dinner was warm and abundant that evening, The small dining table filled with home-cooked food, soft conversation, and bright childish laughter. Warm lamplight spilled across the room, wrapping our little family in perfect comfort and peace. I glanced at my son sitting beside me, at the joyful little boy across the table, at the warm, bright home I'd once thought would forever be empty, and felt complete, unshakable contentment settle in my heart. That terrifying stormy night had brought unexpected reunion, healing, and redemption. It had mended 10 years of broken family bonds, erased a decade of loneliness and regret. I'd endured 10 long years of lonely nights and empty days, clinging to quiet hope through every hard season. And finally, I'd gotten my happy ending, my son home, my house full, my life complete. No grand fortune, no extraordinary success. Just family, warmth, and lifelong peace. That was the greatest blessing of my life. The evening breeze brushed gently through the yard, soft and calm. The years ahead promised only gentle days, steady warmth, and constant family love. Loneliness was a thing of the past. Home, happiness, and belonging were forever mine.